A waitress answered a call in Russian in front of a millionaire. The next day, she was taken to a private jet.
No! Wait, can you just email me instead? I do not understand what you're saying.
The man's voice was firm, but clearly strained.
I said I do not speak Russian. Please, just stop shouting for a second.
He pulled the phone slightly away from his ear, closing his eyes for a beat, like he was trying to will the words into something he could comprehend. "I don't think they're going to email," a quiet voice said beside him. He turned his head sharply to see a young woman in a faded black apron, her brown curls tied back neatly, a notepad in her left hand, and a cautious look in her eyes. "I speak Russian," she added, her tone gentle but confident. "If you want, I can help." He hesitated only a second before handing her the phone, his expression tense with urgency. She brought the phone to her ear, nodded politely as she listened and responded in fluent, measured Russian. Her voice changed, smooth, precise, commanding, without being harsh. She asked for clarification, repeated a few details, scribbled something quickly onto a paper napkin using the pen tucked behind her ear. Within 2 minutes, the conversation was over. She handed the phone back, folded the napkin, and slid it across the table toward him. "If you confirm Klaus 4 via email by 5 p.m. Moscow time," she said calmly, "they'll proceed with negotiations. Otherwise, they'll assume you're rejecting the counterproposal and pull the licensing offer." He stared at her. For the first time in the last hour, his jaw unclenched, astonished. "You just..." He blinked once, relieved. "You just helped me save the biggest deal I've been chasing all quarter." Modest. "I'm glad I could help," she said with a small smile. She turned to leave. Urgent. "Wait!" She paused. He reached into his jacket, pulled out a sleek silver business card, and offered it to her. Formal. "Alexander Stone, CEO, Stone International." She took it, slowly, eyes flicking from the card to his face. Automatically, "I'm Olivia," she said, almost automatically. Humble. "But I just work here." He gave her a look, not amused, not dismissive, but searching, serious. "If you ever want a job that matches what you're clearly capable of," he said, direct, "call that number." Then he was gone. She stood by the counter a long time after the card, in her hand. The napkin with her translation still on the table, outside. The rain had stopped, but the air still shimmered with the kind of tension that came before something changed. She tucked the card into the back pocket of her jeans, returned to her station, and resumed wiping tables. But inside her chest, something had shifted. She had no idea yet that a 5-minute phone call would be the start of a story far bigger than herself. Olivia let herself in quietly. The apartment was small, second floor with peeling paint on the windowsill, and the smell of disinfectant always lingering in the air. Her sister Clara was in the living room, where she always was, propped up with pillows, a book open but forgotten in her lap. Her eyes fluttered toward the door. "Hey, Liv. Is it morning or night?" "It's late," Olivia replied, setting down her bag and moving to check the IV drill. "You're okay. I brought your favorite soup." Clara smiled. "The kind with the little noodles. The exact kind!" Olivia's voice was steady, even when her heart wasn't. 3 jobs, 6 prescriptions, and rent due in 4 days. Everything hung by threads. She tied tighter each day. Still, she pulled out her worn notebook before bed, thumbing through Russian idioms and sentence constructions. The pages were frayed, scribbled over with notes from college days that had ended too soon. She read aloud a line from Pushkin. "Even the darkest night will end." Then, she closed her eyes and slept in the armchair next to her sister's bed. By morning, she had 2 missed calls and 1 text. "Good morning, Miss Olivia. This is Amanda, assistant to Mr. Alexander Stone. You are invited to a meeting at 3 p.m. today, address 4938 Ashwood Avenue." Her heart tripped. She reread it 3 times. The name, the address. She had expected a polite thank you at best, not this. Not something that sounded significant. She spent the next 6 hours second-guessing her outfit. Nothing in her closet looked remotely meeting-worthy. She settled on a dark blouse, black jeans, and the only pair of shoes without visible scuff marks. Ashwood Avenue turned out to be a narrow road flanked by evergreens and electric gates. A guard checked her name, waved her through. She followed signs until she found herself standing in front of a vast hangar. Inside it, a sleek white private jet sat on the tarmac. Stairway lowered, its engines humming low and ready. She stared, frozen. A woman in uniform approached with a smile. "Professional, Miss Olivia, right this way." Confused, stuttering, I thought I was here for a meeting," she said quickly, confused. "You are on board." Her legs moved before her brain did. She climbed the steps, heart pounding. Sure, this had to be a mistake. Maybe there was another Olivia. Inside the cabin was all leather and quiet luxury, and at the far end, Alexander Stone stood, rolling up his sleeves, a cup of something steaming in his hand. Observant. "I guessed you were not a coffee drinker," he said, offering the cup. Warmly. "It's hot cocoa. Real Swiss." She took it automatically, bewildered. "I thought this was a conversation at a cafe." His mouth curved slightly, smirking. "We're going to Vancouver." Assertive. The Russian delegation agreed to move the meeting up by 48 hours. "I need you there." She blinked. Panicked. This isn't what I do. I serve coffee."
I work nights at the hospital.
"My sister." He held up a hand not in dismissal, but to slow her spiral.
You're also the only person I've met in 6 months who can make a Russian executive pause and smile. You know the language, you have presence. I don't need a professional interpreter with a decade of contracts. I need you.
She looked down at the cup in her hands, then at him.
You barely know me.
"I know enough. You listened, you acted, and you're here."
The plane's door hissed shut behind her. Engines roared louder.
And if I say no?
He tilted his head.
"You won't, because something tells me you don't turn away when it matters."
She let out a shaky breath and settled into the nearest seat.
What do I even wear to a negotiation?
He smiled for the first time.
"You're wearing it."
She looked down at her clothes, confused.
"You showed up."
He said.
"That's enough."
The jet taxied down the runway and Olivia stared out the window, her heart still catching up to the rest of her. She didn't know where this was going, but she had stepped on the plane and something in her, some tiny ember of hope, had just started to burn again. The jet had reached cruising altitude and the world below had flattened into shades of soft gray and silver. Olivia sat stiffly in her cream-cold leather seat, her hands clenched around the cup of cocoa that had long since cooled. Her old blue button-down ironed that morning, but wrinkled from anxiety, felt out of place against the elegance around her. She crossed her ankles, trying not to scuff the polished flooring. Her bag sat beside her on the floor. From it, the corner of a worn notebook peeked out. Alexander sat across from her, not saying much. He tapped through emails on his tablet, but his gaze drifted to her now and then, quiet and measuring. When the plane jolted lightly through a patch of turbulence, Olivia flinched. She looked quickly out the window, pretending not to notice the lurch in her stomach. Alexander noticed. Without a word, he stood, crossed the cabin, and reached into the overhead compartment. A moment later, he returned. Not with a blanket, but with a soft wool coat. He offered it to her. She hesitated.
"Just in case,"
he said simply.
She took it. It was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and something she could not name. Something expensive and understated. He also handed her a neatly folded napkin.
"I saw you wipe your hands on your jeans when we took off."
He said, almost smiling.
"Old habit."
She muttered, flustered.
"You're doing fine."
He sat down again, more relaxed now.
"You ever been on a plane before?"
"Once,
She admitted.
when I was 12. But it was economy and bumpy."
"This one's better."
He said, then, after a pause.
"But I understand the nerves."
She looked at him, then, curiosity winning out over her anxiety.
"You don't seem like someone who gets nervous."
He leaned back, folding his arms.
"That's the problem with suits and private jets. People assume they're armor."
She smiled, surprised by his honesty.
"My mother was a translator.
He added.
Grew up in St. Petersburg. She taught me to
Count in Russian before I knew how to spell my own name in English. She must be proud, Olivia said softly. She passed away when I was 17. I'm sorry, he nodded. Me too. They sat quietly for a moment, the hum of the engines filling the space between them. Olivia glanced at her notebook, pulled it onto her lap, and flipped it open. Pages of handwritten Russian phrases, underlined grammar rules, tiny vocabulary sketches. It was battered, but it was hers. Alexander noticed. That's not just something you picked up casually, he said. You've been studying for years. She admitted. Started in college. I had this dream of working for an embassy or maybe the UN, but life doesn't always agree with dreams. He didn't interrupt. I dropped out. My sister had a car accident. She needed round-the-clock care, so I took whatever jobs I could. Her thumb traced the notebook's edge. I kept studying, though, not because I thought it would lead anywhere, just so I wouldn't forget who I wanted to be. Then she added, almost as if confessing, I studied things I was afraid to use, but at least it made me feel like I hadn't disappeared. He didn't speak right away. When he did, his voice was different, quieter. I've met hundreds of people who talk like they've earned the world, he said. But you're the first person I've met in a long time who speaks like they've survived it. She looked at him, startled. You're not invisible, Olivia. She felt something catch in her chest. Not a compliment, not pity, something heavier, warmer. He looked out the window. We land in an hour. I'll brief you on the meeting once we get closer. She nodded. Her heart was still fluttering, but not from altitude and outside. The clouds slowly began to part. The boardroom inside, the sleek glass tower overlooked the Vancouver harbor, where ships glided silently beneath the late afternoon sun. Inside, the tension was thick. A subtle dance of formal nods, porcelain cups, and carefully worded opening remarks. Olivia sat beside Alexander at the oval conference table, a slim microphone in front of her, a small glass of water untouched. To her right, across the table, sat 5 Russian executives, sharp-eyed their postures, rigid, beneath dark suits. The eldest, Mr. Antonov, was head of the delegation, his every word deliberate and weighted. She breathed in as he spoke, listening not just to the words, but the tone, the nuance, the way his eyes flickered between Alexander and the documents in front of him. Then she translated. Her voice was calm and clear. But it carried the subtle inflections that mattered, the uncertainty in Antonov's first clause, the guarded approval in his second, the pride when he described his company's legacy. She mirrored it all, in English, without missing a beat. Alexander nodded, occasionally replying with measured confidence. She translated him back, slipping into Russian with the respectful formality expected in such a setting. At one point, when a younger Russian delegate made a joke under his breath, she didn't translate it directly, but found a way to mirror its humor. Its humor in English, eliciting a small smile from Alexander and a chuckle from across the table. That was when Mr. Antonov's eyes warmed just slightly. 2 hours in, they broke for tea. Olivia quietly reviewed her notes, flipping pages in her notebook with precision. Her heart pounded beneath her blouse, but on the outside she was a portrait of grace under pressure. By the end of the 3rd hour, the draft agreement was provisionally accepted pending final revisions. In board sign-off on both ends, Mr. Antonov stood and extended his hand to Alexander. "You have our respect, Mr. Stone," he said in Russian. Then he gestured to Olivia. "But the woman beside you, she has our hearts." Alexander blinked surprised. Olivia translated, cheeks coloring. Antonov added with a smile, "It is rare to feel understood in business. She made us feel both understood and heard." As they exited the building, the sun had already dipped, casting a golden sheen over the wet streets. Olivia walked a few steps behind Alexander, notebook clutched to her chest, unsure what came next. He paused near a park gate and turned. "Come," he said softly. "Let's walk a bit." They crossed into the quiet path. Under glowing street lamps, trees whispered overhead. "You were perfect," he said finally. She gave a small self-conscious laugh. "I was terrified." "You didn't show it." "I'm glad," she said. "But I was." They walked in silence a few paces more. He glanced sideways at her. "You made me think differently today about what?" He stopped near the edge of a small fountain and looked out over the dark water, about what it means to be good enough. I've been surrounded by Ivy League degrees, fluent speakers, and professionals who charge a fortune per hour. He paused. None of them ever made Antonov smile. She looked at him uncertain. He turned to her, voice quieter now. You reminded me that sometimes the best is not what you're told it is. It's not always the person with the longest resume. Sometimes it's the one who stayed up late, learning for no reason other than it mattered to them. The one who never expected the door to open. Olivia didn't know what to say. Her throat tightened. Alexander looked at her gently. You opened a door today. She looked down at her hands. I didn't even know I had the key. He smiled. Not saying more, the night air wrapped around them in quiet understanding. And somewhere inside Olivia, something shifted. No longer the girl who didn't dare to dream, but a woman whose voice had just translated more than words. The invitation came 2 days after they returned from Vancouver. Olivia had barely settled back into her old rhythm. Back at the cafe for a shift back at her sister's side in the evenings, when her phone buzzed with an official email from Stone International. The subject line read, Offer of Position, Communications Consultant, Stone International Headquarters. Her hands trembled as she scrolled through the message. It was real. They wanted her not just for translation, but for something bigger. A full-time position in the global communications team. It meant
A stable salary, health benefits, flexibility to care for Clara. It meant recognition, and something she had not felt in years. Momentum. She said yes. By Monday, she was on the 38th floor of a shimmering glass tower in downtown LA. Seated at a glass desk overlooking the skyline, her name was on the door. Olivia Bennett, communications consultant. The first few weeks were exhilarating. She assisted in refining presentations for international clients, helped the PR team prepare for global launches, and even rewrote several key passages of a keynote speech Alexander would later deliver flawlessly to a room of European executives. Everyone seemed polite, respectful, almost everyone. Rachel was the first to greet her when she arrived at the office that first day. Tall, impeccably dressed with a practiced smile and eyes that never quite soften. Welcome to the big leagues, Rachel had said, her voice friendly, but distant. Let me know if you need help keeping up. Olivia had smiled, thanked her, and got to work. But little things began to shift over the next 2 weeks. A file she'd carefully translated went missing. A client's name was spelled wrong in a memo she swore she'd checked twice. Documents she left, saved, and timestamped were mysteriously updated after hours. Then came the real blow. An important contract prepared for a Russian client Olivia had previously impressed went out with 3 critical mistranslations. Small words, but massive implications. The client responded immediately, furious, accusing the company of misrepresenting terms, threatening to walk away from the deal. Olivia was stunned when the news hit her desk. She opened her original file. The correct terms were there. She pulled up the one that was sent, identical in format, but altered, subtly, intentionally. She walked straight to Rachel's desk. Did you have access to this file? Rachel blinked. Her expression picture perfect. I help manage all outgoing client correspondence. Why? Olivia said nothing. An hour later, she was called into HR. They didn't accuse her outright, but the subtext was clear. She was the last one to touch the file, as far as the logs showed. With the client relationship at risk, she was placed on temporary suspension pending internal review. She packed her things, slowly. Her hands didn't shake, but something in her chest did. By the time she reached the elevator, her badge had been deactivated. That night she didn't sleep. Clara asked her what was wrong, but Olivia only smiled. Just a mistake at work. I'll fix it. The next morning, she received a personal message from Alexander's assistant. Mr. Stone requests your presence in his office at 9 ing.Osblade. Please come directly. She wasn't sure if it was a summons or a goodbye. Still, she went. When the elevator opened onto the top floor, the hallway was silent. His office door was already open. She stepped inside. A single cup of hot cocoa sat on the edge of the large wooden desk, steam curling upward beside it. A handwritten note in deep blue ink: if you were brave enough to walk into the middle of a storm once, then today, I believe you are brave enough to stand in the center of yourself. She looked up. Alexander stood by the window, arms crossed. His posture still and unreadable. He didn't say anything at first. She walked forward slowly, picked up the note. Then, the cocoa. It wasn't me, she said quietly. I know that stopped her. He turned around, finally meeting her gaze. I've had it. Pull the logs. The file was edited under your login. After hours from a remote IP. Rachel, Olivia whispered. He nodded. She's already under investigation. But that doesn't change the optics. Yet I needed to act quickly. The suspension was procedural, but I never believed it was your error. Her throat tightened. Why didn't you tell me? Because I wanted to see if you would come back, he said. If you would still walk in here with your head high. You did. She didn't speak. He stepped closer, gently taking the cocoa from her hand and setting it back on the desk. This place, this world, is not always fair, he said. But I will be with you. Her eyes burned, but she didn't cry. Not until he quietly added, I trust you, Olivia. That hasn't changed, and it won't. It rained softly that evening. The sky was dim, and the streets gleamed under the weight of quiet storm clouds. Olivia sat by the window of her apartment, her sister Clara asleep in the next room. She should have felt relieved. The truth had come out. Rachel had been exposed. But instead, Olivia felt hollow. There was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Alexander, not in his usual press suit, but in a dark coat, with the collar turned up, his hair damp from the rain. He held a folder in one hand, and something tucked beneath his arm. I thought you might want to see this, he said quietly. He stepped inside without ceremony, setting the folder on her kitchen table. Olivia followed inside. Were the digital trace logs, metadata, records, and internal memos. The documents were neatly clipped, annotated in Alexander's handwriting. One paper showed the exact timestamp of when Rachel had accessed the file. Olivia had translated 37 minutes after Olivia's last save from a different terminal. She left a trail, Alexander said simply, and I followed it. Olivia sat slowly, her fingers tightening on the edge of the table. I don't understand why she did it, she said. Fear, he replied, of being replaced, of becoming invisible. It makes some people cruel. She looked up at him. You believed me from the start. I didn't need to believe, he said, taking a seat across from her. I verified. I don't trust words. I trust patterns. And the pattern didn't match you. He slid a small piece of folded paper toward her. She opened it. I don't believe in accidents. I believe in traces. She smiled faintly, a tear threatening to fall.
Why did you come tonight, she asked. You could have sent this through HR. Because truth deserves more than an email, he said. It deserves to be delivered by someone who sees it. He stood up, walked to the window, then turned back to face her. You walked into my world without asking for anything, he said softly. But every time you spoke, something in the room changed. People listened. I don't know if I belong in your world, Olivia whispered. Alexander studied her. Maybe not, but maybe I don't belong in it either. Not if it allows people like Rachel to thrive, and people like you to doubt themselves. He walked back over to her, set a second item on the table. Her favorite brand of dark chocolate and a travel-sized bottle of lavender hand lotion. Small things, he said. I pay attention. That was when she realized he had always been watching. Not to test, but to understand. She stood slowly, the silence between them filled with something too big for words. He moved toward the door, but paused. I'm not standing here tonight to be noble, he said without turning around. I'm standing here because when someone is right, when they've done right,
They deserve someone beside them. Then he looked back. And today, that someone is me. The door clicked shut behind him, but Olivia didn't move. She stood there, heart full and throat tight.
Staring at the folder, the paper, the chocolate, the lotion, all pieces of a story that told her, you were never invisible. And for the first time in years, she believed it. The villa stood on a quiet slope above Lake Geneva, a blend of stone and stillness, its centuries-old walls bearing ivy like a coat of memory. White curtains rippled through the open windows, catching the mountain air that whispered through the rooms like something holy. It was a place removed from time, untouched by deadlines, unbothered by titles. For 2 weeks, the villa became a haven for the international team working on a groundbreaking partnership with the United Nations, an initiative for global digital education. Olivia had been invited not just as an interpreter, but as a strategist, and Alexander, officially attending as CEO of Stone International, arrived with his usual command, but seemed lighter here, more watchful, less armored. On the third evening, Olivia slipped into the library after dinner, drawn by the flicker of firelight and the scent of leather-bound books. Alexander was there, seated in a deep armchair by the window, sleeves rolled up, his tie gone. A book rested in his lap, forgotten as he looked out across the darkening lake. He noticed her, but didn't speak right away. "It suits you," he said softly. She tilted her head, unsure. "The room, this place, Geneva?" "You," he clarified. She walked toward the fire, letting the warmth touch her skin. "It's peaceful," she said. "Feels like nothing bad could happen here." He nodded. "Or maybe it's just you. Maybe you carry peace with you." The quiet that followed wasn't awkward. It was the kind of silence that makes space for breath, for understanding, for things that don't need way.
To be said later that night, Olivia returned to her suite. The lights were low, and on her desk sat a small, elegant box. No card, no explanation. Inside was a fountain pen. Midnight blue enamel silver trim, her initials, delicately engraved near the base along the barrel, in cursive so fine it looked like a whisper. To the one who speaks in truths, not just in tongues. She stared at it for a long time, unsure if her chest was aching or simply full. Then came a knock. When she opened the door, Alexander stood there. No blazer, no corporate facade, just a man, quiet, unsure, holding his breath. "You liked it?" he asked, nodding toward the pen in her hand. She didn't answer, not with words. She stepped forward and kissed his cheek, not for effect, not for romance, but for truth. He didn't move, didn't say anything, just looked at her with something close to awe, and she looked back, open, unafraid. Whatever had been tentative between them wasn't anymore. They didn't fall into each other that night. They didn't confess undying love or plan a future. But something settled, something real, in the days that followed. They worked as a pair, not just colleagues, something closer. At meetings, their thoughts aligned before their words did. Over dinners, they talked, not of business, but of beginnings. He told her about his mother, a quiet woman who had taught him Russian poems before bed, who never raised her voice but always made herself heard. She had passed when he was still young, and some part of him had gone silent with her. She told him about Clara, her sister's laughter. Before the accident, the way her eyes still lit up when the world made sense for a second, and how Olivia had learned to speak softer, slower, to reach. Her language, she said, was the thread that kept her stitched to the world. They never once asked, "What are we?" They didn't need to. One morning, before the summit's final session, they stood in the stone kitchen sipping espresso, the early light filtering in. Alexander reached for a document, then paused, his hand grazing hers. "You're the first person I've ever wanted beside me," he said quietly. "Not behind me, not following." Beside, Olivia didn't speak. She just let her fingers linger on his for a moment longer. That was enough. The waters of Lake Coast shimmered, like liquid glass beneath the spring sun. Their surface kissed by ripples of wind and light. A soft hush had fallen over the world, as if even time had stopped. To watch, at the edge of a green cliff, cradled by cypress trees and crowned in history, stood a centuries-old castle wrapped in white roses and climbing ivy. Lavender and lemon blossoms perfumed the breeze, weaving through silk drapes and ribbons that danced along stone railings. Bells chimed through the morning like whispers of something sacred within. The sunlit courtyard, rows of white chairs had been arranged on the cobblestone terrace with careful intention. Each seat held a guest from a different chapter of the couple's life: executives, ambassadors, childhood friends, and quiet neighbors.
Who once smiled at Olivia as she rushed to her third job? They sat now with phones put away and hearts open, bearing witness not just to a ceremony, but to a story that had unfolded in silence, through words, and finally, into love. At the back, the music began, strings soft and swelling like breath, and then Olivia stepped into view. She walked slowly, steadily, dressed in a white gown of silk that caught the light like water. There were no diamonds sewn into the hem, no lace detailing her shoulders. The dress was simple, honest, like her, like the journals she had once filled with Russian idioms and pages torn from forgotten textbooks. She did not hold a bouquet. Instead, in her hand was a small fountain pen with a silver clip, midnight blue, the one Alexander had given her in Geneva. Alexander stood, waiting at the altar in a suit of dove-gray linen, the color of morning fog. His posture was calm, grounded, but his eyes, those impossibly tender eyes, never once left her. Not when she reached him, not when their fingers brushed, not even when his voice trembled as the officiant invited him to speak. He inhaled, the sound barely audible, and then met her gaze. "When I met her," he began, voice low but unwavering. "She did something no one else had ever done. She listened. Before I had said anything, a gentle murmur moved through the guests. She did not ask what I owned. She didn't care where I had flown from or who sat beside me. She answered a phone call in Russian, a language I did not know. And in that moment, she rewrote every sentence I thought I understood about trust." But he paused. A faint smile flickered at the corners of his mouth. She saw me, not as I was, but as I could become. When it was Olivia's turn, she stepped forward without a tremor, though her heart thundered softly beneath her ribs. Her voice, when it came, was steady and sure, first in Russian, Protov, then in English. "I promise to be your voice when you are quiet and your silence when you just want to feel." She smiled through the shimmer in her eyes. "I will be the interpreter of your heart for the rest of our lives." From the front row, Clara clapped first, slowly, deliberately. From where she sat in her flower-draped wheelchair, her joy lit up her face as if she too had known all along that this moment would come. Then the bells rang once more. White petals drifted from the balconies above, caught in the breeze like blessings. And beneath that soft shower, Alexander and Olivia leaned into each other, lips meeting for the first time as husband and wife. It was not just a wedding, it was a promise, spoken in the quietest of dialects. A punctuation mark at the end of a sentence begun years earlier in a tiny cafe, where a girl answered a call, and in doing so, answered her life. And beneath the Italian sky, among roses and wind and all the ways two people can learn to understand one another, a story that started in translation found its truest meaning with love, with trust,
And a future made not of fortune but of choice. Thank you for joining us on this incredible journey from a quiet cafe to a castle on Lake Calivia. And Alexander's story reminds us that sometimes one small act of kindness, a voice offered in the right moment, can change everything. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you believe just a little more in the quiet magic of second chances, we invite you to be part of our community. Subscribe to Soul Stirring Stories for more true-to-heart tales like this, stories of love, resilience, and the extraordinary power of simple human connection. Your next favorite story is just one click away.